Thank you, everybody. Apologies for the slight delay while we got the live stream working. But Audit Committee, welcome to this meeting of the Audit Committee. And I would particularly like to welcome those members of the public and press watching the live stream. As we've just seen, as with all technology, there's always the possibility of something going wrong with the live stream. If anything should go wrong, I will need to adjourn the meeting until the issue has been resolved. If we are unable to resolve the issue, it will be necessary to postpone the rest of the meeting. Can I just, while we're talking about live streaming, just remind you all, please, to turn your microphones on and speak into the microphone, otherwise people watching can't hear what's being said. And also a reminder to turn your microphone off after you've spoken. So this is the first substantive meeting of the Audit Committee this municipal year. Many of us are new to the Audit Committee, and I look forward to working with you all for the benefit of our residents and the council. Brings us on to agenda item number 1, public question time. Tracy?
No questions, Chairman.
Thank you. Item 2 is apologies and substitutions.
We've got a full house, so
yeah, we have a full house. Welcome, everybody. Item 3 is declarations of interest. Does any member have any interests to declare for any items on the agenda? Nope. Thank you. Item 4 is minutes, and this is to approve the minutes of the meetings held on 20th of March and 25th of May. Does any member wish to raise any points of accuracy with any of the minutes? Firstly, on the 20th of March. And can I have a proposer? And I'm not sure we can.
Since I was there, I'll propose.
I'm not sure how we can get actually asked for a second. Okay, thanks. And secondly, the 25th of May. A proposer?
Yeah, I propose.
Thank you. And a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Christine. Councillor Christine Whelan. Item 5 is Chairman's announcements. I have no announcements to make this afternoon, which brings us on to the first substantive issue. Agenda item 6, external audit results report, final update. And can I ask Mark Hodgson of our external auditors EY to introduce this report? Welcome, Mark and Jacob. Mark, could you also please give committee members any information you may have about the audit plan for 2022-23, either before going into your report or at the end of the report? Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'll do that question or answer to that question at the end.
Thank you.
So this audit results report is, as you say, our final one following the presentation of our provisional version to the committee on the 20th of March. And whilst we went through a lot of detail at that meeting on the 20th of March, appreciate that this committee has a new membership and you are responsible for authorising the financial statements, which is the next item. So I'll go through the key matters which we see as being critical to your role. So since the 20th of March, the procedures that we marked as outstanding at that March date have now been concluded. So we now have only the final closing procedures to conclude, which ordinarily follow the approval of the accounts at a meeting such as this. And therefore we are proposing to sign the audit opinion on Wednesday this week. So just to give you some key highlights and pull out some matters. So on page 5, in terms of materiality, we're working to a materiality level of £900,000 for the council single entity accounts and 1.05 million for group accounts, with reporting thresholds at 45,000 and 53,000 respectively across both of those. In terms of audit differences on pages 7 and 8, there are no unadjusted audit differences of which you should be aware, which is clearly a good position to be in. And there are 7 key or material corrected differences set out on page 7, with items 5, 6 and 7 having emanated from the procedures we closed since the 20th of March meeting. So just to run through those 3 specifically, but then I can happily take questions on items 1 to 4 afterwards. In terms of item 5, This was in respect of the incorrect omission of the community infrastructure levy. So no accrual was made within the accounts, but an invoice was subsequently received and expenditure is now recorded within the revised financial statements at 550,000. In terms of item 6, the council moved to a new fixed asset register during 21-22 financial year, as reflected by our significant risk on page 15. Our review of the transfer of data identified 2 errors, one related to the overstatement of the revaluation reserve from brought forward balances, and the second, a subsequent accumulated depreciation overstatement. Those 2 have now been corrected. And then in terms of item 7 and group accounts, the group accounts were updated because the subsidiary entities audit was completed by Price Bailey. There were a number of adjustments made through the audit of both companies, and those clearly then flow up into the group accounts, and those adjustments have been made as well. We also identified one disclosure adjustment, which impacts on exit packages note, and that has a lower materiality level. So we're flagging it here, and 25,000 of employment provision was omitted, but is now included in that exit package note with additional narrative. In terms of audit areas of focus, these are on pages 8 and 9 of our report. These are, in essence, a summary of all the audit risks that we presented in our audit plan in June last year, and then all the assurances that we have got against them. It sets out the audit differences where applicable that link to that previous section I've just referred to. There are probably 2 points here that I would pull out for you as a committee. So in terms of pension valuation, there was a further amendment of 2.6 million required as a result of the impact of the triennial valuation report, which was dated on the 31st of March 22, but issued on the 31st of March 23, so after the last committee. That has, in effect, considered assumptions which were in place at the balance sheet date and therefore needed to be reflected within the pension liability. And that has now gone through as well. So there were 2 adjustments to the pension liability throughout the audit, the previous one being reported in the last audit results report. And then we've also set out a control weakness in respect of journal authorization, which links to section 6, and I'll speak more about that in a moment. Section 2 from pages 12 through to 20 has full details of all those risks with the procedures that we performed, and then the assurances gained and the audit differences raised. So that is just more detail on the areas of focus that I have just been through, and happy to take questions on any of those individually after I finish. And then when we step back and take that all together, in light of the revised accounts, which are the next agenda item, we would propose signing an unqualified audit opinion on Wednesday, as I said, and the wording for that is set out in section 3. In terms of value for money, the audit report does set out any matters that we need to report in relation to value for money. We did not identify any risks, and therefore we have no significant weaknesses in arrangements, and therefore have no matters to report within that audit opinion. Section 5 has a little bit more detail. So back to the control weaknesses. The more detail is on pages 34 and 35 of our report. We've identified 4 areas where controls can be enhanced. Recommendations 1, 2, and 4 were previously reported in March. So I'm not going to say a lot now, but happily take questions. I'm sure you've read about them. But in terms of recommendation 3, this is new and follows the conclusion of our journal testing procedures. The council does not have an authorisation process in place before those journals get posted to the general ledger, and we would ordinarily expect there to be a segregation of duties between a preparer and an authoriser of a journal before they get posted to the ledger, and therefore when the financial impact hits. Given that's not the case, we've made a recommendation for a review of that. So that's the key points from the audit results report. Happy, as I say, to take questions. But first to answer the question about 22-23. So given the well-documented delays in audits in public sector across the UK and pan audit firms, we issued a letter on the 13th of March and again on the 31st of March to chief finance officers, setting out that we would not commence any 22-23 audits until the 1st of November at the earliest, therefore closing out any historic audits for 21-22. That is still the current position. Do note though that a deluxe select committee is actually in meeting now, and the minister was due to give an update on the proposals for future of public audit at that meeting. Clearly, I don't know what the outcomes of that are. As and when we see the outcomes, we will reflect on those and see if that makes any change to the letters that we have issued.
Thank you, Mark. Members, any questions for Mark at this stage? Councillor Kane?
If you're not able to start the 22-23 audit until November, do you have a rough idea of when you're likely to complete the work?
Not currently. So the letters say we won't commence any audits, so we haven't yet phased the work programme for 22-23 yet.
So effectively you're saying you're not actually saying our audit will begin in November, you're saying no audits will begin before then. Ours may actually begin later.
Scheduling to be determined, yes.
Chair, I don't know how much influence we can have over DULUC, but there have been a lot of ideas going around over the last few years about how they can improve this, and it is getting almost pointless to have the audits if they come in when the year before is over.
I get what you're saying. I mean, I sent that note round after that webinar I attended, but and a lot of the talk then was about making it more proportionate as to what was required in the audit, as I said in my note. However, let's wait and find out what's been said by the select committee today. Councillor Kane.
So I think in the meantime, we need to look at what we can do as an audit committee, because effectively that's a key control for us, having
Absolutely.
External audit report. And we now know we're not going to get the 2022-23 audit report this calendar year. We don't yet know when we'll get it next year. So I think we need to give some thought to how we gain different sorts of assurances since we don't have that one. And one of the things I'd like to suggest is that we did look at, when we first formed, at the idea of having a sort of rolling process, a bit like the one internal audit's doing, of looking at areas of risk and inviting the lead officers for those areas of risk to this meeting, so we can talk to them about what controls they have in place, how they review them, how they monitor them, so we can satisfy ourselves that those areas are well under control.
Okay, we'll take that away and think about it. As you say, something we ought to be thinking about. Is there any questions for Ian if there's nothing further for the external auditor? Councillor Kane, I see you raised one on the advanced questions. Is that answer okay for you?
Thanks for reminding me. No, it wasn't. I know it carries a standard format. Indeed, we have the draft here. What I was really asking was what sort of work the senior management team do to ensure that they're able to sign up to all the commitments they're making in the letter of representation.
I mean, the letter representation is a consistent letter over a number of years, and the processes which are detailed in it have been consistent within the council for a number of years, and so therefore, yeah, it's an ongoing monitoring of procedures to ensure that they correlate with what is expected in that letter.
Thank you, Ian. Right, if there's nothing further on this. I'm sorry, Councillor Kane.
Sorry, there wasn't a recommendation to go with this. I wondered if there should be a recommendation that we note the report. We welcome the decision to produce a SIPFA checklist for the 2022-23 accounts. We propose that the council puts in documented authorisation for journals before posting, and we propose that the council reviews its minimum revenue provision policy in line with expected statutory guidance.
What I heard was right. The MRP one was covered off at the March committee. Our external audit said it was only
I think the officer indicated that we weren't proposing to do it. I'm saying I think we should propose to do.
Ian?
Our treasury management strategy for 23-24 as approved at council in February assumes the MRP position remains as it was in previous years, and that and so therefore that is what the council has currently approved. Now, clearly we can review that in light of any legislation that takes place, but as highlighted in the report, this is expected legislation as opposed to anything which is become law at this point, and so therefore it would be, in my opinion, more sensible to wait until we have final legislation drafted, so we're very clear what would be expected from us.
Yeah, I can certainly follow that train of thought. Councillor Kane.
So can we ask external audit why they recommend it?
So clearly the MRP calculation is both detailed and forms a key part of treasury management policy. As Ian says, this guidance is likely to impact 23-24 financial year, so the one you are currently in, and therefore having a robust policy and practice for that calculation for this financial year is key. But the guidance is not issued yet, so
Rock and hard place from the sound of it.
But in principle, the auditor is telling us that it's key, so it seems to me that we ought to do it.
Well, yeah, my view on external audit, and I think I'm talking for my colleagues here as well, is quite clear. Unless there's a very good reason not to, then we should be taking up external audit's recommendations. Yeah.
And just to make committee aware, since we in the finance team had seen the audit recommendation about journals, we had started to implement a approval process for journals, but that will only have started midway through this financial year, because as in when we saw the recommendation.
Good, I'm pleased to hear that. Okay. I think we're all in agreement. Yep. Thank you. We will move on to agenda item 7, which is statement of accounts. And can I ask Ian to actually before I do ask Ian to introduce this item, guys, give my view on our role here. As far as the statement of accounts it's to assure ourselves that the external auditor has undertaken their work appropriately rather than checking the accounts line by line. I would hope everybody would agree with that. Ian.
Yeah, the statement of accounts which you've got in front of you was the position as at the date the agenda was published. Clearly, as Mark highlighted, external audit continue to do final checks on the said document, and they expect to conclude those checks in the next couple of days. So I can't give you a guarantee that this is the final version at this point, but obviously anything which is picked up by external audit, if it's believed to be, will be given due consideration, and if considered not to be material, will be adjusted with the approval of myself, with the chair of the committee, and with the external auditors.
Thank you, Ian. Firstly, can I have a proposal from seconder for the recommendation to approve the 2021-22 statement of accounts?
Yeah, I will propose.
Thank you, Councillor Pettit. So I have a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Horgan. Any further, Councillor Kane and both groups. There's been questions raised. Are we okay with the answers given? Yeah. Any further? Okay. Well, actually,
Sorry, just I'm glad to see that the actual street cleaning sort of business plan. I was sort of looked back at that. I had to sort of obviously scroll back because it said click here on the actual thing. So just it's good that we're actually looking at the measures that we're doing and going forward, the scheduling of the street cleaning. I think that will help the residents very much so, so that they know actually when they're going to be taking place and when actually to move their cars. I would welcome that as well.
yeah. Thank you. Councillor Horgan.
Yes, so I was just going to check with you, Chair, whether or not my question about the use of the word substance had already, because you said that you were going to ask that, but I didn't see a written answer. So if not, I'm happy to ask the question now.
It was used substance. I did have a word with it, and I'm sorry it's not in here. Because materiality has a very specific value in the accounts and the external audit report. That's why he didn't want to use the word material.
Okay, but the question was whether substance, the use of the word substance here is the same as in the audit term substance over form, which is a defined or recognised term. So I just wanted to check that I was being new to the audit game. I was just trying to make sure that I understand the use of terminology. So is substance here the same as substance on the term, substance over form as recognised by anybody that does auditing?
I mean, I think how I'd answer that question is that clearly there are materiality issue amounts in the audit planning. Those in most cases will be what we'll use in relation to whether we believe, myself in the chair and EY believe we've got approval to make changes. But I think where I was coming from is if a figure.
So sorry to interrupt, Chair. Could we turn the air conditioning off? Because A, it's getting very cold, and B, I can't actually hear what Ian's saying.
Get the words a bit lower, but
Oh, that's fine.
I think my view was that if a figure has to change by more than the materiality level and it relates to a note as opposed to one of the main statements, that's probably okay still, depending on what the note is. But clearly, if one of the main, or the IE accounts, the balance sheet, had to change by something bigger than the materiality level, then that wouldn't be appropriate.
That would come back to committee.
Yeah. So it's a distinction between the notes and how they feed into the overall, the main statements, i.e. the I&E statement in the balance sheet.
Sorry, I was just checking because obviously the question I'm asking is the use of substance here. As I recognise substance over form as an auditing term, is that the context it's being used in, or is it being used in a broader sense than that?
I think I've just explained in the best way I can why I use that word.
Thank you. Members, we move to the debate if there's no further questions. Councillor Kane.
It's not a debating point really, but I have struggled to get my head around the various iterations of the accounts and the various iterations of the audit report. I think it would be extremely useful if this happens like this again in future years. If we could have some clear schedules of what has changed between one point and the next. So what I would have found very useful would be a schedule that showed what has changed since the accounts we looked at in March, and any changes the finance director is aware of since these that he's going to have to put through. There may be none, but it would be useful to have that schedule. Because I don't have it, I can't get my head fully around the accounts, so I'm afraid I'm going to abstain on this. It isn't meant as any statement that I think they're wrong. I've found it very difficult to understand the statement about the restatement of the trading company accounts, for example, that the auditors made. And then I checked with the finance director and there hasn't been a change since they published their accounts in September. So I don't understand why there's any change required between what we saw in March and what we're seeing now, whether it was put through. I just don't fully understand it, and so I'm afraid I'm going to abstain.
Okay, fair enough.
But I would ask in future that we could have those sorts of schedules, because unfortunately, for nobody's fault, it's, you know, the system is grinding to a horrible halt. We are likely to have a similar situation next year where we look at the papers several times. It would be really useful to have a schedule of the changes between each time.
Noted. Yeah.
Thank you for those comments, Councillor Kane. I mean, I think from my perspective, because EY are still doing their final checks, I didn't feel I was in a position to provide you such a schedule. Clearly, if they had finished their work, then I would have been able to provide you such a schedule. But because they are still doing their very final checks, I didn't think it was really appropriate to do so. But I hear what you're saying and comfortable with doing that in the future, you know, when we get into position. In relation to, I've forgotten the other point I was going to say. With regard to the group accounts, that was right. Excellent Audit may want to correct me, but my understanding is the group accounts have changed because obviously if the main accounts change, then that has to feed through into the group accounts. So the group accounts have changed because of things which have identified, but the actual trading company themselves accounts haven't changed since back in September.
Yeah, so that element is still the same, but other bits have changed, so the groups. Yeah. Gotcha. Right, we have a recommendation in front of us, proposed and seconded to approve the 2021-22 statement of accounts. All those in favour, please show. Those against? Abstentions? Thank you. Got that, Tracy?
Yes.
Great, thanks very much. Brings us on to agenda item number 8, the annual internal audit report and opinion 2022-23. Can I please ask Rachel Ashley-Corn to introduce this item? And actually, Rachel, I know you and I have met before, but because there's so many new people on this committee, could you just introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair. So hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Yeah,
Excellent. So I'm Rachel, I'm the Chief Internal Auditor for North Northamptonshire Council, and we also deliver internal audit services to a number of other local authorities, including yourselves at East Cambridgeshire District Council. So I think that as an audit committee, obviously every internal audit service must by nature be independent, but I think it probably gives you that extra level of comfort that we're one step removed, I suppose, as well, that we are not within the management structure of East Cambridgeshire District Council as well. So we deliver all of the internal audit function that you would expect, and I will be a regular attendee at all of your audit committee meetings. So it's good to get to know the members of the meeting. So I think it's important as well, obviously you do have direct access to me and I have direct access to the audit committee. That's an important element of the public sector internal audit standards. And that's obviously the basis on which we operate. So that's just a little bit about me. So basically, one of the key roles under those public sector internal audit standards is that every year, as your Chief Internal Auditor, I have to provide you with an opinion over the Council's governance, risk and control framework. So that needs to be informed by the work of the audit team and any other sources of assurance that I think I can place reliance on. And the report that's before you today, the first report I'm bringing to you is that internal audit annual report and opinion for 22-23. So what I'll do is just run the committee through some of the key sections of the report, and then I'll obviously be happy to take questions on any of the detail as well. So the opinion is set out on page 3 of the appendix of the full report. So within the box, we've got the assurance statement, and then I've broken that down a little bit into the different sections, the different categories around financial controls, risks, and internal controls. So the categories that we apply, I've set out for you in section 4.1 of the report. Now, I will note, just for one member of the committee will recall, we did approve a new internal audit charter in March 2023, which did introduce new audit opinions. So just for clarity, I have applied the assurance opinions which we used during 22-23 for consistency, because I don't want to cause any confusion with those. So just to note, those are the opinions that we've used in here. I've given you in the report, but going forward, they will be as per the new internal audit charter that was approved in March. So the opinion that I've given for 22-23 is of satisfactory assurance. So as I say, that's defined further in section 4.1. But essentially, it confirms that you have a sound system of internal control generally within the council, but we have identified areas where controls could either be improved, they could be sharpened a little bit further, or where compliance hasn't been consistent throughout the year. So that's reflected in some of the findings that we've reported. I am pleased to be able to say that you didn't receive any audit opinions of below satisfactory assurance. So anything that was below satisfactory, I would have pulled out, particularly within my audit opinion. I also would have focused on anything that received an organisational impact of moderate as well, but you didn't receive anything less than satisfactory or anything more than moderate. So there's nothing that I've noted specifically that would undermine the overall opinion of satisfactory. So table 1 on page 5 provides an overview of those assurance opinions, and then table 3 then expands on that further. So you then have a line by line analysis of each of those audit assignments and the audit opinions that we gave based on our findings. So again, just for the new committee members' benefit, just to talk through this briefly. So for each of the audit assignments, we give 3 types of opinion. So rather than just giving you one opinion and a RAG rating, we try to split that down. And this is primarily for the audit committee's benefit, really, that I think this is useful because it puts the findings into some context. So the first opinion that we give you is around the design of the control environment. So this would be looking, for example, at whether there's policies in place that are up to date, whether there's procedural coverage, whether there are the right controls built into systems. So that would give you the opinion over what controls are actually in place and how they've been designed. The second part of our opinion on each audit is around compliance. So this is split into 2 because we could have an area where there's a really good policy or a really strong process, but nobody's applying it in practice, or vice versa. You might have a really poor policy, but everybody's adhering to it. So I think it just gives you that understanding as a committee as to what is the nature of the problem. Is it that we just haven't got the right control, or are people not applying it appropriately? So that's why we've split that into 2. And then the third part of the opinion is the organisational impact. And this is just really to try and put findings into some context for you as a committee as well. So it may be, for example, if I was to do an audit of a very specific grant of £5,000 and it had really poor controls, and I might give it a limited assurance opinion. But in terms of your organisational impact, it might actually be low because there may not be a great deal of risk exposed as a result of that poor control. On the other hand, we may look at something like, I would say, safeguarding related, for example, or IT security related. And if that was poor, it could expose us to a high level of risk. So again, it's just trying to put all of those findings into context. So you've got all of those set out for you in table 3 from the audit plan for 22-23. Now, the vast majority of these were reported to the audit committee as part of my progress reports throughout the year. So I've just included in there the committee date when the summary of the audit was presented. And as you can see on the agenda today, we've obviously got a latest update for you as well. So that's a quick run through of the audit coverage. So other things that I take into consideration in reaching my opinion are the audits that are completed for Anglia Revenues Partnership. So this is a service that delivers your revenues and benefits service, the collection of council tax and business rates, housing benefits, etc. So we don't deliver the internal audit service there, but I receive the internal audit reports from our partners. So what I've done is tried to give you the equivalent, well, I've quoted their assurance opinions in here in table 3, so that you can see those. And I've tried to, the equivalent would be either satisfactory or good within our own assurance opinions based on the definitions that they'd given. So I'm satisfied again that that doesn't undermine my overall satisfactory assurance opinion. I also had to report to the audit committee in March that we would not be conducting the audit that was planned on cybersecurity in 22-23. As there was a lot of work underway to deliver an action plan in addressing a number of vulnerabilities from an IT health check. And pending that work, I would have found it difficult to give an assurance opinion whilst that was in progress. So what I was assured of by management at the time of reporting in March was that I would have an PSN public sector network compliance certificate that I could place assurance on before I produced my annual opinion. And I'm pleased to say that I actually received that in May. So I've been able to refer to that in my report here as a source of assurance on cybersecurity. But I can reassure members that we are now starting our cybersecurity audit. So we will also be able to feedback on the wider assurance that we conduct as part of that as well. The other thing that I take into consideration when I reach my opinion is what actions management take where we do identify an area for improvement. So if we're finding things, if it's being acknowledged and addressed in a prompt manner, obviously that gives me assurance that the control framework is working well. So for that reason, you have details on the implementation of agreed management actions within the report, which is detailed in table 4 in terms of a summary. And then table 5 as well expands on that. So during the year, 85% of the recommendations that were due were implemented. And then we had 15% which were overdue. Now, this is as at the 31st of March, because I wanted to give the committee that snapshot as at the end of the financial year. What I would say is that whilst you had this number of recommendations overdue at the time of the end of the financial year, a number of those have since been closed. So you will note in the next committee paper today, we've got the latest update on the position of those actions, and those high priority and mediums have been closed, and we only now have 1 low and 1 medium overdue. So I don't intend to go into those in further detail as part of this report, as those have now been implemented. But because there were a number of actions, I have given you a breakdown in table 5, just so you could see which actions those were that were outstanding at the end of the financial year. Also within the report, we reflect on the delivery of the internal audit service, so our own performance. And so, as I said, we have delivered 100% of your audit plan, and that enables me to give you the assurance that I'm happy I'm able to give an informed opinion, and that we've delivered that schedule of work that we refer to as the audit plan, which was consulted on with the audit committee and approved before we made a start. So that's set out for you on page 10. We've also reflected on our performance against some of our key performance indicators. So one of those is that we issue a customer satisfaction survey at the end of each of our audits. So that goes to the head of service or the lead service manager and the director, just to ask them about how they found the audit process. And we asked questions in relation to 4 different areas. So I've summarised those for you in table 5. So I couldn't be happier with the feedback on communication during assignments, which received 100% responses of outstanding. So I can't ask any more of my team than that. And obviously, I think that is a really important area as well, because we should have that ongoing engagement. People should feel that they're consulted and they're aware of issues, so there are no surprises at the end of an audit. So I think that's really pleasing to see. And also within the report, I have reflected on our conformance with the public sector internal audit standards. So we do that annually and report back to this committee if there was any areas I felt where we were not conforming. We do have some very robust quality assurance processes within our service. We make use of a case management system, which means that every single test has to be independently signed off before it goes through. And I review every single audit report that goes out. So having spoken to colleagues at other authorities, I think that's more robust than we see elsewhere. I have mentioned in here that there is currently a big consultation out to look at some new global internal audit standards. We're still waiting to see what the outcome of that will be in terms of the public sector. It looks like we may not be getting new public sector internal audit standards based on what I've heard so far. So then it will be a question of, do we have to comply with the new internal audit standards, or do we comply with the old? And we'll need some clarification. So pending the outcome of that, we're obviously still considering when would be a good time to have an external assessment when we know what we're actually assessing against. But obviously anything in that area would come back to this committee as well in terms of the outcomes. So I've gone through that in a little bit more detail than I usually would, just because I wanted to make sure the committee is aware of the detail, and I'm conscious that you didn't all receive those reports throughout the year, but I'm happy to take questions on any of the detail. And ultimately the report is for you to consider. It should be a key source of assurance for the audit committee. It should be something that feeds into your annual governance statement as one of your key sources of independent assurance. And yes, so hopefully that's useful for you, and I'm happy to take any questions on the detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Our recommendation is that we note the annual internal audit report and opinion, and I'm happy to propose that from the chair. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Kane. Members, any further comments or questions to Rachel on this report? Councillor Kane.
I don't have a question, but I would like to make a couple of comments. The first is for new audit committee members with the safeguarding audit, which we got in November. Although it said satisfactory, we all felt very uncomfortable because, as you've heard, satisfactory means that in theory everything's fine, but that in practice there's one or two areas where it hasn't been happening as it should have been. And so we got a written confirmation from officers fairly shortly after that meeting that all the agreed actions that were high and medium had been actioned. So that's, I think, partly why you've changed the terminology. But it was followed through very rapidly because we all felt the nature of what it was made it more important. But the other comment that I really wanted to say was I want to thank Rachel and her team because I think that they've provided really, really helpful reports throughout the year. They've always given meaningful answers to questions raised, and whenever I've asked for a full copy of the report or something, it's come very rapidly. And also they introduced this idea of the rolling risk register review, which has been incredibly helpful. At the risk of sounding like a repeating record, scratched record, I do think it would be even more helpful if we could question the risk owner at the meeting where those are reported to, so we could enter into a dialogue about that area of the risk register. But the report itself, knowing that those controls are in place or not, is incredibly helpful. So I would like to thank Rachel and her team for the work.
Echo from the chair. I trust it will be the same going forward. I look forward to working with you. Members, we now move to the debate. Do we have any debate on this item? If not, it's been proposed and seconded. All those in favour? Thank you. It's unanimous. Agenda item number 9 is internal audit progress report. Rachel, over to you again.
Thank you, Chair. So we are now looking ahead to the new financial year. So we are now in 23-24. So as I mentioned earlier, we provide a report at each committee meeting to give you an update on our delivery against the audit plan. So the audit plan is essentially the schedule of work that we've agreed we will deliver during the financial year, and that is consulted upon with the audit committee and senior management. It's informed by your risk registers, and it's then formally approved by the committee in March ahead of us making a start on it on the 1st of April. So primarily, firstly, I wanted to make sure that this committee has a copy of the internal audit plan. So that's provided on pages 6 and 7 of the appendix 1 to this report. So each of the assignments is set out for you with an indication of when we plan to make a start on the audit based on the financial year, the quarter of the financial year. And then as they're completed, you will receive the outcomes in those 3 bold columns as well, to enable you to monitor that throughout the year. So in each of these updates, you will receive an overview of the scope and the outcomes of audits that have been finalised during the period. So that's in section 2.3 of the report. So this time it's pages 2, 3 and 4 of the paper. So within this report, we had 2 reports that have been finalised. The first related to 22-23 audit of asset related audits. So this was a follow-up piece of work where over the last few years, we've done a few asset related audits. So we've grouped those together here to do a bit of follow-up work. Firstly, we've looked at things around your fixed asset register, so records of fixed assets, how those are managed and updated. And that has resulted in some recommendations around things like reviewing the useful life for depreciation purposes, and a few of those actions that we wanted to follow up. So I'm happy to say that when we followed those actions up as part of this review, all of the actions had been implemented. As you heard earlier, new software has been applied for the risk fixed asset register. I'm mindful we didn't go into the detail of testing it because we're very keen not to overlap with the work of our colleagues in external audit. So whilst we followed up the specific actions around the actions we wanted to be completed from our last audit, we didn't do a full audit of the register, which we're mindful of. Obviously the external audit, we already had that one in hand. So those actions had been completed. In particular, I was happy that there are now physical verification checks taking place. So ultimately, I just wanted to see that there are officers going out once a year to make sure that the assets, including vehicles or plant that we have out at depots, for example, has been checked against our records to make sure that we've got a record of everything, but also everything we think we have is still there and in working order. And I've seen evidence that has now taken place, and there are actually photos to prove that on the system as well. So it makes the assets more identifiable for future checks. So that was good progress in that area. The other areas that we looked at were around compliance regimes within our assets. This is more around asset management. So firstly, we looked at operational assets. So that's looking at like the Grange, it's looking at the depots where we have certain council services being delivered. And here we have a responsibility for making sure that we're compliant with requirements around gas safety inspections, electrical installation, water testing, all of these things. So we want to make sure that that's all being tracked and that's being managed appropriately. So the audit was able to give assurance over that those checks were taking place, and there was a means for monitoring that and taking forward remedial actions. The note we have noted in the report, which is provided on page 3, around the exceptions at some of the sites at the depot, which at that time we weren't able to see records of, so we're not able to give assurance that those have been completed. But as I've comment on that further around this further training that was taking place to try and address that gap. The other area, the third area really that we've covered is around leased assets. So as opposed to the operational assets, these are assets where we actually have a source of income. So we're leasing them out or licensing them out to third parties. So here we still have responsibilities around certain requirements. So whilst the tenant in most cases is responsible for a number of those compliance regimes that we mentioned, we should be making sure that we have EPC ratings for all of our assets. Now, this is something that we highlighted because that did change from April this year. The original requirements changed. Previously, we'd made a recommendation around making sure we had them at the time of either issuing a lease or renewing a lease, which was the legislation at that point. But we also advised that needed to change from April, that we actually need to have that EPC rating throughout the whole life of a leased asset. So there were, when we revisited it this time, there remained some assets which still hadn't got an EPC during their life cycle. Obviously, for some long leases, this is something that hadn't happened before. So we have made a recommendation around that, and that should be in hand. And finally, we looked around the invoicing arrangements as well, and we wanted to see some stronger controls around tracking of rent reviews in particular, and making sure those are being completed in a timely manner. So overall, the control environment here, we go satisfactory based on some of those controls, particularly around the rent reviews not being in place. Compliance generally was good, although we've noted, of course, some exceptions, but those appeared to have already been acknowledged and were in hand. So we've given a good assurance opinion on that, and a minor impact overall based on what we've seen and the action that was being taken. The second report related to fees and charges. So the council obviously has a number of fees and charges that are applied by all of our council services. For the purposes of this audit, we were looking at the two distinct areas, starting with statutory fees, where we have to charge a set amount, which is set nationally. We don't have any choice over the amount that we charge, whether it recovers costs or not. So we did test 100% of your statutory fees, and we were able to confirm that all of those were compliant. So we have no issues to report there. We did also look at your discretionary fees, where we do have an option to apply the rate we think is appropriate, depending on how much the service costs to deliver. Generally, we're not supposed to make any profits out of that work. It should, over a rolling basis, cover its costs. We obviously don't want to be delivering something at a loss either, so we need to make sure we're making informed decisions on that. So we've looked at this, and we were able to confirm that inflationary increases have been applied each year. Only two of the services that we looked at within our sample had actually had full reviews to actually inform that pricing, to see that we're actually recovering costs and that we're comparable with other authorities as well, do a bit of benchmarking as part of that review. So we were able to see that for two. The others that we looked at, we weren't able to see that evidence, so we did make some recommendations around that. And as members will note, there's also on page 4 a reference around the e-space rental charges and the issues we identified there, which again, we've made a recommendation around making sure that's addressed going forward and subject to the right levels of controls and approval. So based on those findings, primarily, we were only able to give a moderate assurance opinion for both the design and the compliance with the controls, and a medium organisational risk in relation to those findings. So just to refer members as well to later in the report, there is the definitions for all of those assurance opinions on page 15 in the glossary. And as I mentioned earlier, these are the new ones as per the internal audit charter that was agreed in March. So they obviously differ from those you saw in the previous annual report. We've also given you an update on the implementation of audit recommendations, which has been particularly positive during this period. We've had 100% of high priority recommendations implemented. You now only have 2 recommendations which are overdue. One is of a low priority, which we tend to classify as things that are nice to have. It would be an improvement in terms of efficiency, but it doesn't expose a risk to the authority. So that doesn't give me any cause for concern. And the other is a medium priority. So there is a medium level of risk assigned to this, but it's less than 3 months overdue, and it actually became due very, very soon before these statistics were produced. So, and I have already received some feedback on it as well. So I'm happy that it's in hand, and we hopefully be able to close that one before the next update. Finally, we've also got the latest of the real-time risk review outcomes provided for the committee in the report. In table 4 is the full detail. So just again, mindful of the new audit committee membership, just to give a bit of an explanation about this. So this is a process that we, Councillor Keynes referred to, and we introduced during 22-23. So within risk management, as your chief internal auditor, I need to remain independent, so I can't be part of your risk management process. So I wanted to find a way that we could give you some assurances without being part of the process and without doing a full audit of every risk every year as well. So the idea of this approach is that it is not an audit, and we are not giving an audit assurance opinion over how well the risk's being managed. But we work through each of the controls that's been listed on the strategic risk register in relation to that particular risk entry, and just confirm whether it's in place and is it operating as has been stated or not. So within the risk register, which you'll obviously see later on the agenda, there is an inherent risk score, which is essentially what would happen if we didn't do anything, if we weren't actively managing the risk. And then you have the residual or the current risk score, which is based on those controls being in place. So the fact that we're relying on those controls, I think it's important that you know they're actually there and they're actually happening. So that is the purpose of these reviews. So just to give that assurance really about what we're looking for here. And as I say, there's no audit assurance opinion. We're not saying these are the right controls or whether there's any gaps. We're just confirming whether or not what's stated is what's happening for the purposes of this. Obviously, if we did an audit of that area, that would be a different scope. So within the findings, you'll see each of the controls from the risk entry listed out, and a RAG rating as to whether or not we were able to confirm it as evidenced in practice. There were only 2 where we have highlighted a recommendation to clarify the wording in the risk entry. The first was what we've coded as A203, which referred in the strategic risk register as it was to reporting to Finance and Asset Committee and full council. Now, when we looked at the evidence, there actually isn't any reporting to full council on a regular basis. And we discussed that with officers, and we just recommended that that wording needs to be clarified if we're saying that this reporting is taking place and it's not actually standard practice. Quite similarly, on page 13 on A207, there is a reference to the section 151 officer and the monitoring officer being present as non-voting members at the board meetings. We've actually got details of the attendance records, which we've recognised in the findings. And based on the findings and the discussions with officers, we've again suggested that needs to be amended to clarify that actually those officers are invited to attend as observers, but are not required members of the board to attend every meeting. So if that's the case, we just recommend that that wording needs to be updated. And again, it's not for us to define what it should be or how it should be worded, but we've just highlighted that currently it's not reflected in what's in the risk entry. So those amendments have actually been made, so you will see them later on in the papers in the risk register update. And I think that's everything. We just also, there's the latest customer survey feedback has been 100% outstanding again. So again, I'm very pleased with the team on that on page 9. I think that's all of the key sections of the report, Chair. And obviously the committee can expect to receive the reports on all of the remaining assignments as part of future reports going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for a very comprehensive introduction to the report. From the chair, I'm happy to propose the recommendation that we note progress made by internal audit in delivery of the audit plan and the key findings. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Kane. And members, any further comments or questions to officers and guests? And before I go into that, we have had a number of questions and answers provided. And I should have said earlier on when I first referred to this, for those watching and for the benefit of everybody else, these questions and answers will then become part of the minutes of the meeting. So they will be published at the same time as the minutes. Councillor Kane, do you have anything on your question?
But first of all, both on the asset related audit and in general, I want to congratulate and thank the officers, because when this audit committee started meeting, we had quite long schedules of audit actions that were overdue. And today we're looking at one that has a handful of things on it. So that represents, I think, a lot of work on behalf of the officers. So I'd like to thank them for that. And in particular, the asset related audit stuff all seems to have been put in place already, which is really encouraging that internal audit is noticing things that could be better and they're being made better. That's excellent. Then moving on to, I don't know whether this is best tackled here, but or under the risk register, but the review of the controls that are in place for ECTC up to a point is encouraging. I do want to come back on one of the audit recommendations, because unusually I actually disagree with it. But I still, what we're getting here is whether these controls are in place. I'm still trying to understand whether these controls actually deliver what they're claiming to deliver. So it's obviously important, for example, that we have a business plan, but just having a business plan doesn't in itself ensure that ECTC will deliver against the business plan. And similarly, having a shareholder agreement, articles of association, I still don't fully understand how they control the governance for sure, and they're really important, but I'm not sure how they control it delivering on its business plan and its expected levels of performance. I think it's interesting, the definition of delivering on the business plan, in that it says the nature of the property element of the business plan means that in some years house sales are not always in line with the business plan year. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make. We're trying to control a commercial business plan for an organisation that is building or contracting people to build and selling houses, and that in itself is a very specific risk area. It carries a lot of money from the council, and I'm not convinced that the controls we have in place are adequate to manage that risk. I'm pleased to see we're going to get our seminar in September, but you know, it was meant to be at the end of the financial year. I understand why that was postponed. We were then told summer, and now we're told September. That is a timetable in our control, and I think we should get it back. It's never really happened consistently at the end of the year, and I think we should get it back to doing that. Again, I think having an independent chairman is incredibly important, but I don't see how it actually controls that we meet the business plan. And yeah, so I'm not entirely satisfied on the ECTC, but the really important thing is A2.07, the section 151 officer and monitoring officer. We had the control that they're present as non-voting members at board meetings. Internal audit uncovered that in fact they're not consistently present at board meetings. And so the suggestion is that we change the wording to invited. I really don't think the fact that they're invited gives us any control at all. I think we should keep that wording as attend, and we should ask those officers to attend and possibly even report on attendance to this audit committee. Because if those two officers aren't attending, obviously there'll be occasions when they can't, but if they're not attending routinely and regularly, then I don't see that that's a control at all.
Well, thanks. Just on that final point, it's quite clear because the section 151 officer has attended all 14 meetings. And I would agree that he's expected to attend.
Yeah, I think we should keep the wording attend, and we should ask our officers to attend rather than change the wording to just invited.
View on that, Rachel?
So obviously our recommendation is just to amend the key control to provide clarity on the actual role and required attendance. So that's for the council to determine. We're not saying whether it should or shouldn't be, but at the moment, all we can say is, as it's stated, doesn't appear to be supported in practice. So that's the solution suggested by officers, was that it would be clarified that actually it's not mandatory. If that's how it is and that's the role, that's for them to determine. But obviously we are not able to edit the risk entry. It is for the risk owners to own that and decide what the right control is to have in place. So
Understood.
I mean, obviously, as it's detailed, I mean, I have attended all the meetings, but I mean, I think the view which came out of the audit and why we wanted to correct it is that it was almost too hard a wording, and it's almost as much as if the monitoring officer in section 151 officer weren't at the meeting couldn't take place. Now, clearly that is not the case, and so therefore we wanted to choose some words which meant those people were invited, indeed expected to attend, but clearly if they didn't attend, the meeting could still go ahead without them. We're just trying to get that balance right.
So it's something like it's the use of that. So what we wanting is that expected to attend. Yeah. Okay. Any further comments or questions, or do we need to move into a debate? Councillor Kane?
Yes, I noticed that we're going to conduct a formal review of discretionary charges, the ones that haven't been reviewed for the last 5 years, by April 2024. I'd like to suggest that we should bring that review forward, because I presume we'll be looking at our fees and charges across November 23 to February 24, because that's the normal sort of timetable. And that review it would be more useful if that review was done before we formally agreed the fees and charges for 24-25. And if we wait till April 24, that wouldn't be implemented, I assume, until 25-26. So I'd like to suggest that we move those forward so that they're done by the time we look at our fees and charges for 24-25.
Councillor Kane, I'm sure Rachel has heard what you said, but I'm very clear in my mind we cannot direct internal auditors to
No,
when they do
this
it, but I'm sure she's heard the rationale as to why you think it should be brought forward.
No, she made the recommendation that they be reviewed. It's our officers who said that they would be reviewed by April 24. So I'm asking our officers to review them, I guess, by November 23, so they can go into our review of fees and charges, which happens in that cycle.
Clearly, I can't speak for other officers, but from my perspective, I fully understand Councillor Kane's coming from, and I'll use best endeavours to ensure that is the case.
Thanks, Ian.
And then the other thing I picked up was that a very large proportion of our rents on our e-spaces at Littleport and Ely are being charged at rates below those agreed by council. Now, I absolutely understand that when you're having negotiations with tenants and prospective tenants, there are going to be differences. But I wondered if there should be some reporting back to council, finance and assets, somebody of those where we're charging less, not in the specifics, obviously, but just, 80% of them we're charging X% less. I also wonder if there's a limit on the discount over which it ought to come back to council or committee for approval, because I think the average difference is around 22-23% less than we've agreed. So I wondered if perhaps any discount of more than 20% ought to come back to council and committee for approval. Otherwise, we can lose control of what's going on in those places. I was pleased to see there's now an internal officer approval system, so it protects the person who's doing the negotiation. They're no longer at risk, as it were, of accusations of collusion or whatever. So that's good, but I do wonder if over a certain amount it ought to come back to council and committee.
I think we need to refer that to Finance and Assets Committee for them to come to a judgment on it. To see, yeah. Okay.
I mean, all I say with that is, again, I understand the comment made, but clearly individual rents for individual companies is quite commercially sensitive information. So we'd have to be careful how, we wouldn't really be able to put that into the public domain, but that's not to say that committees couldn't see it in private session. Yeah.
Oh, yes, clearly it's commercially sensitive. I'm not saying it should be plastered all over the Ely standard or somebody's made. Anything further? An internal audit progress report. If not, I echo the thanks again to Rachel and her team. It's always encouraging to know that you're clearly doing a job, because you're picking up what needs to be picked up. Right, brings us on to item 10, corporate risk management update. Ian, you're introducing this one?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. You've got in front of you the most recent risk register as produced by the risk management group when at their meeting in June. Appendix 1 details changes which were made to the risk register at that time, and then obviously Appendix 2 and Appendix 3 are the risk register itself and the heat map. As you know, obviously there was 3 things changed at the meeting, and those are detailed in Appendix 1, and hopefully committee members understand why those changes were made. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Right, we have a recommendation in front of us that we be assured the council is appropriate in monitoring its corporate risks, and these are detailed in the corporate risk register as set out in Appendix 2. Can I have a proposer and seconder, please?
Happy to propose.
Thank you, Councillor Pettit. Have a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Horgan. Members, we've had a.
Sorry, Chair, I'd like to propose an amendment.
Right,
I'd like to propose that the committee notes the corporate risk register and asks the risk management group to change the control on A2 and A6. This is the one we've already discussed, to section 151. Officer and monitoring officer are expected to attend board meetings as representatives of the council and report on attendance to audit committee. Ask the risk management group to review risks A6 and C3 in the light of the 2022-23 overspend of almost 500,000 not being reported to council until February 2023, internal audit reports and other evidence. And 3, invites members of the audit committee to attend the meeting when this review is discussed.
you haven't got that in writing, have you? Because it was quite.
Yeah, I've got
It
it
is-
in writing, so I can share it.
It's on the question.
Sorry,
Was it on the questions?
I don't remember seeing that on the questions.
No, it's not on the questions. It's not on the questions. Yeah, no, it's not on the questions. I've brought it with me. So I can share it with somebody, but
Personally, I would find it very easy. I always find it much easier if I've got something in front of me rather than trying to remember precisely what it said. So can we just hold for a couple of minutes while Tracy gets some copies for us?
so sorry, Chair, that's not how it's happened in the past. In future, I'll bring I'll share written amendments before the meeting.
So it's just personally, I just find it so much easier. Thank you. Welcome back.
Thank you. So little one was just to ask to change the control on A2 and A6 to expected to attend board meetings, and we've already discussed that. So this is just formalising it.
Yeah.
And then the risks A6 and C3. So A6 is the risk of East Cam street scene failing to deliver on its business plan and expected levels of performance. Regrettably, last year we know it didn't deliver either on its business plan or its levels of performance. We know that it had to come to council in February for additional fees. The internal audit report covered some issues at the depot where various health and safety compliance tests were in some cases not being carried out and in several cases not being documented. And there's other evidence, but that's on blue papers, so I don't intend to go into it in detail, that in fact it hasn't been fully delivering to the business plan or expected levels. And C3, of course, is non-compliance with legislative and regulatory requirements, which not having the checks and tests documented is a non-compliance. So I am concerned that suggesting that the risk of non-compliance, the residual risk, is just 3, i.e. everything's hunky-dory, and the risk of failing to meet business plan and deliver expected levels of service, the residual risk is just 10. And the importance of these is how they get escalated and treated by senior management. So if a risk is 1 to 4, so that's what we currently have the residual risk for C3, it's a low risk and monitor as necessary. If a risk is 5 to 15, sorry, this is Appendix 3 to our corporate risk register paper, that's an amber risk and it gets 6 monthly monitoring. I honestly, in my view, but obviously the risk management group, I'm asking them to review it, I think these risks should be being monitored regularly because we know that they've occurred, and we know they've occurred in several different types of iteration and relatively frequently and over relatively long periods of time. So I think we should be asking the risk management group to review the risk on these. And it's not just a theoretical numbers game, it's about the level of monitoring that these get from senior management. And I think these merit regular monitoring. What new members may not realise, that the risk management group doesn't produce any minutes or any notes of its meetings. So we don't know exactly what thoughts and what discussions have gone on around them coming up with a risk. I note from some SIPFA audit training that I did that it is quite normal for members of the audit committee to be invited to attend risk management group meetings. And so that's why I'm suggesting we won't all be able to attend because it won't be convenient for all of us. But if at least we are invited, we know when the meeting is, we can attend and we can listen to the discussions. And hopefully, as the original recommendation says, be assured that the council is appropriately monitoring its corporate risk, because I'm afraid as it stands, I'm not assured, but I think these suggestions would help.
Any comment? Right, let's have a look at this. Little one, I have no issue with. Little two. Yeah, I entirely see that that's our role. That's the risk management group to review those two risks. Just not sure about. Just like to give some more thought about members of the audit committee attend the meeting. Ian, would directors have a view on this, do we think? Or not? Well, actually, did internal audit have a view on this? No, I'm putting you on the spot, aren't you?
Yeah.
It's short notice,
No, I
which is not fair of me.
No,
It's okay, forget it.
No, to give some comments from, I'm just thinking of experience elsewhere. I don't think it's something, I obviously don't sit on risk management groups generally because I'm independent of the
Yeah.
process. So I can't speak definitely, but certainly with Northamptonshire Council as an example, the committee have their discussion at the audit committee meetings. There isn't any discussion outside of the committee meetings, but nor is there a risk management group to go along to, because it's more that the risk owners manage their risks and they report it in, and then it's centrally managed and it's a document that's just maintained. So it's not a group as such. I think more what I've seen elsewhere is more of the discussion in the committee meeting and maybe more of a deep dive into particular risk areas when officers would attend. So that's more in my experience.
Okay.
I would be happy with that as an alternative. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find a way to move forward on this, because in the past we haven't invited the risk owners to our committee meeting, and so we haven't been able to have these discussions with them. So I'm trying to find a way forward that would allow us to understand the discussions and feel a confidence that this is being monitored appropriately. So I'm happy with an alternative to little three. If it was that we're going to invite the risk owners to this meeting, I think that would be a really good step forward and possibly a better step than little three. But I've been trying that for 18 months and failing miserably.
Councillor Horgan.
Well, I note, according to the risk register, that for A6, the risk owner is present, as is our Director of Finance. But obviously, C3 is the corporate management team, which I think is a larger body of people. So that could be quite a lot of people that would come here. But I was interested to understand how the people that manage each of these risks as owners, how they operate in silos, or do they operate as a team effectively in sharing ideas and thoughts to make sure to get the balance right, that their assessment of it, or are they left alone to set their own expectations of risk? Or who checks the checker?
Well, as we have the risk management policy and framework review on the agenda for the next meeting, that's where we'll have that discussion. Sorry, yeah.
I think we would need to be clear that the risk management group is all the directors at the council plus the health and safety manager of the councils. That is the corporate risk group. So it's a high level group where all of the risks are reviewed. You know, obviously individual members of that group are individually responsible for risk, but each of the risks is reviewed by the group in totality, and the score which is in front of you now is the view of the group. So, and the other thing to say is that I am the chair of the corporate risk group, and so therefore I am here representing their group. That's why I don't believe there's any need for other members of the group to attend this meeting. I'm here representing the group as the chair of the group, and will take away any comments from members. Clearly, I can't adjust the scores of any of these based on the discussion we have here at committee, but equally, anything which is minuted will be raised at the next meeting of the risk management group, and we will consider whether the points raised do impact on how we view the risk, and whether we want to adjust the score based on that information.
That's what Christie will.
What I'm concerned about is with these meetings that the risk management are having, that there isn't any minutes of those meetings at all. How do we know exactly what's being said and what's being decided if there are no minutes to these meetings?
I mean, the view has always been that the risk register itself is the minute, and you know, the part of the meeting is that we make changes to the risk register as we discuss it in the meeting. So I'm not sure what additional, how having individual minutes would assist. The risk register sums up the views of the meeting, and obviously everything is recorded in the risk register itself.
Agree. Councillor Kane.
I think what we're missing, because yes, the risk register is effectively the summary of the decisions. What we're missing is the discussions. As we've heard, they often happen at this committee. The alternative would be some form of deep dive, or as I've suggested, us being invited to attend the meeting. I'm left not understanding how we've arrived at some of these risk calculations, which, as I say, the important thing for me is not the number, it's what that then means for the level of monitoring that those risks get. We're not getting the argument, so I don't understand why what has happened over the last 18 months or so doesn't seem to have changed the residual risk so that it gets more closely monitored, because I would have expected that it was being very closely monitored. It was seen as a high risk. And so I want to understand the reasoning behind the decision that I see on the risk register.
I can understand where you're coming from. When's the chief exec back? Councillor Kane, would you allow, could we agree 1 and 2, and could you allow me to, and yourself as a leader, as far as that, as lead member, for us to have a discussion with the chief exec?
I would be very happy to accept 1 and 2. Maybe you and I could approach the chief exec about 3.
Sorry, that's what I was just saying.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I thought you said you or me. Sorry. Yes, I'd be very happy with that proposal.
Right. Okay. So, right. Are we clear? Looks like we're all in favour. So 3 changes. comes out. For myself and Councillor Kane as Liberal Democrat Group lead member to approach the Chief Executive. Okay. That brings us on to the forward agenda plan. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I had some specific points to raise as well. if
Sorry,
I may.
Councillor Kane.
Yeah. On A3, which is the failure to deliver on the housing strategy. I asked the questions about housing need. I'm not sure the answer I got, because I asked what is the assessment of affordable housing need, and I was told Cambridgeshire and West Suffolk states 215 households per annum for affordable housing to rent. I'm not sure if that's the East Cams share of that or all of Cambridgeshire and West Suffolk. But nevertheless, it is a lot, and I wonder if we're delivering to it, because the numbers we've got is affordable housing completions, but a lot of those are shared purchase, 100k homes, things like that, and this is specifically housing to rent. Again, I'm not entirely convinced that we've got that risk level. I would also say I tried to find our housing strategy, and we do have one published on the web as under our list of current policies. It's not dated, but having read through it, I think it's probably from 2001. I asked the officer for our housing strategy, and I was told we don't have one. It's we refer to a range of policies in order to decide that. So right at the start, failure to deliver on the housing strategy, I'm afraid I'm not even convinced that we're clear what that is. That's not for this committee. Maybe we can refer it to the relevant committee. Yeah, I'm not convinced we know what the strategy is. It's certainly not published as a strategy unless we rely on the 2001 one, which in many ways isn't bad, but it is very, very dated. And I do think this business of empty social houses, I really think we should try and get that information, because my group are getting various reports and queries from people that suggest there may actually be quite a lot. And as we've got 1,039 people on the housing waiting list, it would be nice to know what we're doing about that empty housing to get those people into. 88 of them are in urgent need. So
I can assure
again,
you,
not for this committee, but it kind of indicates to me that the risk isn't correct. A4, homelessness in the district. Oh no, I was happy with that answer. That was a good one, where they actually did seem to have considered that they'd made a change to something and what change that might have on the risk, and they felt in fact it made things stronger. I'm not sure I agree, but I understand their thought processes and I find that useful. But conversely, they don't appear to have considered on their risk rating the impact of interest rate increases. When I wrote my question, fixed rate mortgages were 6.6%. I'm old enough to remember the dreaded day when I had to put my house on the market when interest rates went up to 15%. So I kind of thought to myself, well, how bad is 6.6? But then I thought, how much had I borrowed? I'd borrowed, I think, about 70,000. People now have borrowed several 100,000. So this is a huge impact, and it worries me that we haven't considered it in our analysis of the risk, although I think they have said that they're keeping it under review. But I I'm not sure we're keeping on top of that. A6 we've already discussed, so I won't go through that. D8, I'll go back to the human resources manager because I don't understand how they've only lost 3.27 days from long-term sickness when long-term sickness is 21 or more days or a calendar month. So I don't quite understand the answer, but I'll go back to human resources about that.
So the way I read that is the total days lost was 635. And it's 3.27 full-time equivalents. Or am I reading it wrong?
What full-time equivalents of all our staff, you mean? So I'll deal with that outside the meeting because it's
Okay, right, so can we move on then to the forward agenda plan? Tracy, I'm going to ask you to introduce it.
Yep.
I do have something else to
Um,
raise.
Yep, obviously, this is the forward agenda plan, the first iteration of it for this year. But obviously subject to what happens as far as the statement of account side of things I suspect it's maybe subject to change.
One thing I would like to raise is certainly when I was at CPCA Audit and Governance Committee, I believe it's good practice across the country for committee members to meet with audit without other officers being present. I'm getting nods from all the other side. Could we schedule in before one of our meetings, as in rather than meeting at 4:30 if we met at say 4 o'clock? Would that be okay with yourselves? Do we want to pick a meeting to do it at? October or January? Sorry.
We were just thinking that by January, we might have an idea of when the audit is going to start, if it hadn't already started, whereas October, it would still be not yet is the answer.
Okay, so shall we say the January meeting then? Just checking with Mark, who's clearly looking in his diary. Great, so Tracy, could you just make a reference to that on the forward agenda plan for the 29th of January meeting? And I'll say if we could. Sorry, Councillor Kane.
Thank you, Chair. I think that's going to be a useful session. There are some things that I would like to suggest. SIPFA recommends that audit committees do an annual review of their work, which we haven't yet done. To be fair, Councillor Every did start the process, and I struggled to respond, partly because of the template they were using. I would like in October us to do an annual review of the committee. I know it will be difficult, but you'll have to go through the minutes. Using the SIPFA template, because SIPFA do a template of how audit committees best practice, and we could go through that and look at whether we're doing that. And then they also recommend that you do an annual report to full council. So you're saying to them, as your audit committee, we have complied with best practice, or in these areas we haven't because, then the whole council understands what we're up to. And we have confidence that we're following best practice.
Again, my experience at CPCA Audit Committee, we did that. Rachel.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to add in there that it's actually something that I'm doing with all of my audit committees, actually. A number of them have had new membership. So what I've recommended is that we're going to look at doing exactly as you've described towards the end of this calendar year. And some of them I'm doing it with a group of councillors. Obviously, you've got a smaller committee here, so I think it makes sense to do it as a full group. But I'm more than happy to help support with that process if that would be useful. I've also delivered training to all of my other committees on the new guidance, because CIPFA did issue new guidance at the end of the last calendar year, which included the new checklists. And it is tailored specifically for local government this time as well. There's some guidance on police and local government have split it out, so it's a lot easier to use. So I'm more than happy to help support with any guidance on that. And I think towards the end of this year would probably be a good start, which could then feed into an annual report, which again is the timetable I'm working with all of them on to do a bit of an action plan if anything comes out of that assessment. And what we could then do is use that to inform perhaps a training plan for the committee as well, of any particular areas that you think you would benefit from training on. And again, there's a number of those that I'm happy to help deliver rather than you buying in external deliverers for training if that's appropriate. But I'm more than happy to help with that if that's you.
Thank you very much. always happy to accept offers of help. Yeah, that'd be great.
Sorry, I've got another couple of things I'd like to add. I know it's really difficult, but at least let's be optimistic. I would like to add the external audit plan for 23-24 to the March 24 forward agenda. And
unless miracles happen, as you say. Yeah, yeah. I mean, we might obviously have to roll it forward, but
I know,
let's
but
put
I
it on
think
there
we should
somewhere.
at least establish that that's the aspiration. And I also think, I know we haven't got July 24 on here, but I think we should also establish with the officers that we expect the annual governance statement to come to our July 24 meeting, regardless of what's happening with the statutory accounts.
The annual governance statement is in some ways a funny one, in as much that it has to be signed off at the same point as the statement of accounts are signed off. And so therefore, if there are delays in signing off the statement of accounts, to prepare the annual governance statement soon after the end of the financial year only leads you to the potential need to revise the annual governance statement for events which happen after the year between its final draft stage and the point where the statement of accounts are signed off. And that's why we haven't brought it to this meeting, because we are aware of obviously the likely time in when the statement of accounts are being signed off in to therefore to push through the annual governance statement this early in the year doesn't add any value to the process.
That's okay.
A lot of the annual governance statement relies on the internal audit report, and we've looked at the annual report today. It's fresh in our minds. It would be good if we were looking at the annual governance statement in line with that, but also it lists those areas where we want to make improvements in the coming year. And if we don't do that until beyond halfway through the year, it's going to be difficult to make those improvements. So I think it belongs in the July agenda. I have to defer to what the Section 151 officer says. My understanding was that we didn't have to wait for the annual accounts. We did, in fact, I thought, sign off the AGS at our March meeting when we didn't have the annual accounts. But even if we do have to wait for the final signing off when we have the annual accounts, actually this committee reviewing it in July and making sure that substantially it reflects what's in the annual audit report that will have just gone through at the meeting, and that it has identified things that we as an organisation want to improve over the coming year. So we as an audit committee know what it is we're trying to monitor, as it were. I think having it in the July meeting is really important.
let's put it on the forward agenda. And then we'll see where we're at come July. Okay. Anything else? If not, thank you everybody for attending and your inputs. We'll see you in October.